Hello, everybody. Welcome. Hopefully you all are here to listen to us talk a bit about web editing in 2D using the JavaScript API. So my name is Heather Gonzago. I am a product engineer here with the JavaScript API team. Been with Esri for a while now. So some of you who may have been doing some dev summits in the past may be familiar with some of my previous sessions as well. In addition to me, I also am joined with my esteemed colleagues, Paul Barker and JC Franco. Paul, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hey, welcome. My name is Paul Barker. I'm a product engineer with the ArcGIS Online team. I used to work with the apps team back in the day on Collector, so I've got a background in kind of mobile data collection and editing, and I work on various things in online around feature services, views, arcade, and kind of just a mix of stuff. What about you, Franco?
Hey there, I'm Juan Carlos Franco, and I'm a software engineer with the JavaScript API team, and I work with widgets and things of that nature. Thank you for joining us, Heather.
Great, awesome. So with all of those introductions aside, also I wanted to point out, before we even get started, we have a short URL here that points to Franco's repo, which is where we will house all of the slides for this session, in addition to any of the demos that we're going to be showing. We will also have this at the end of the presentation as well. All right. So some of the things that we're going to discuss over the next 45 minutes or so, we're going to briefly talk about just web editing in general, what is required when working with editing in the web within client applications, what we provide in the JavaScript API to try to make your life a little bit easier, and that's in the form of various editing widgets. Paul is then going to start, Paul will take over then and discuss working with forms and how to make collecting information and so forth within your application a lot easier and smarter. And then Franco is going to finish everything off and show us how we can customize and work within the actual editor and make it specific to your workflows. And at the very end, we will have some time for some questions and answers. Hopefully we'll be able to get to most of them. If not, we can also follow up after everything. All right, so web editing. So when we talk about editing on the web, the very first thing I think you need to remember is that we are working primarily, you're going to be working with a feature service. So a hosted feature service that will have editing enabled on that. The feature service, I'm just going to go ahead and open up a link here. So what I'm pointing to right here is just our documentation on our site that points to our REST API doc. This is just basically just a description, and it talks about what the actual feature service is and what it does under the hood. So when we talk about the layers that we access and we work with within our editing applications, these layers are going to need to be derived from a feature service that has editing enabled on it. So we talk about, editing needing to be enabled. Some of the different operations that you can specify are certain things like, creates and deletes, updates, and so forth. You can actually, when you create the service itself, you can specify or constrain specific operations that you want to have your users, that you want your users to have access to be able to do. You might allow them to do anything, all of it. Or maybe you only want your users to be able to go in and update specific features. You don't want them to have to, you don't want them to be able to add or maybe modify geometries. You only want them to update attributes. You can actually constrain that down at the service level as well. So there's different ways of doing it. And we're not going to go into detail on all of this, but I did want to show you this because, and the reason I'm showing you all of this is because the editing when we work with editing and web applications, it reads these constraints that you have set on that service level. So in this case, I created a feature service that has editing enabled, and I just did this within ArcGIS Online, and I just opened it up. I enabled editing, and you can do all of it. But let's say maybe I didn't want my end user to be able to go in and add features. They can only update features. I could go ahead and modify or constrain that here at the service level. One thing to keep in mind when we talk about this, though, is that, and this is across the board, this is not just a JavaScript thing. The client apps are not going to have the capabilities to override the underlying permissions on that service level. So if you have data that is shut down, basically, you cannot edit it. Let's say there's no editing on it at all. You cannot access that, or you will not be able to take that layer into your application and use these widgets on that or try to override that. Basically, service level is always going to take precedence. All right, so another thing, again, I talked about is just a feature service. So under the hood with all of this, it really is just the REST API. We're using our the JavaScript API or our client APIs to access into our REST API calls. So what we have is, and this again is the REST API doc, we have our feature service, and I just went in here, and what this is showing is the apply edits call that you can access off of the feature service. So the information and what you can do here with off of the REST API, for the most part, is offered, the equivalent should be offered on the client side, so within the JavaScript API. And I'll show you that in just a moment. All right, so when we talk about editing in the browser, there's a couple different ways of looking at it. Initially, when 4X first came out, we didn't have all of the widgets that you see here right now. If you wanted to do any type of editing, you pretty much had to do it off of the feature layer, and that would be like the granular API. So getting to the feature layer, calling that apply edits, similar to what you have in the REST API, and then passing in those edits that you have within the code itself. So that was possible, and it still is possible, and many times you might need to do that for your specific workflow. But if not, we over the years and the releases, we have created these widgets to help make this easier for you. So basically, when we think of these editing widgets, it's just encapsulating specific functionality of our API in a class for the most part. So we have our editor widget, which is kind of like the big one, right? But that editor widget itself actually is comprised of various smaller components, smaller widgets. So we have our feature templates, which is basically what you see when you open up your editor, how those, the symbology for your features, how they show up. We have our feature form, that's any type of attribute editing. We have attachments. So if you have a feature layer that has attachments enabled on it, and that feature that you are editing has an associated attachment, that editor will automatically recognize that. And unless you shut it down, it will show that attachments widget for you to allow you to do any type of edits. And then the only thing that you might notice is slightly different here is we have the sketch view model. So when the editor, and I'm not going to go into a lot of details on this, but primarily when the editor was first implemented, we did not have the actual sketch widget itself. So when we talk about widgets, we have a UI portion of it, that's the widget. And then we have the underlying view model of it. And that's kind of like the guts to it. It's the behavior and the logic for how that widget is supposed to work. So at the time when the editor was made, we did not have the actual sketch widget at that time. So what we did was we took the sketch view model, which we did have, and used that behavior for our edits. So anybody who may be familiar with working in the editor right now, and I'll show you in just a moment here, it's going to look slightly different because it doesn't have the exact sketch UI that if you've worked in the sketch widget that you might be familiarized with. But again, under the hood, all of this really is calling, when you're working with these widgets, it's calling the apply edits. Okay, so when we make these edits to whatever we're doing on these layers, these widgets are there basically just to help us, but still under the hood, we're making those REST calls. And then here at the bottom, doesn't really apply to the editor, but I threw in the feature table because we can now do editing as well. Not recently, it was in a couple versions ago, but we can edit within the feature table as well. All right, so that was a lot of information. I don't want to go into too many details on all of the different widgets that I just discussed, mainly because that would probably take a session and a half or more just for that. But what I would like to do is mainly just show you the SDK of where you can find more information on this. So this, what I'm showing you guys right now, it's not going to be what you see. And I apologize for this, but I wanted to make sure that I give you the most updated stuff for 4.19. 4.19 will be out next week. Our SDK that we have on our production site will be updated to reflect that. This is a local build with the 4.19 SDK, but I wanted to make sure that I showed everything so that you guys had a good idea of what's to come. So what we have here in the API reference is, if you take a look at the widgets, it's going to give you a listing of all of them. I'm just going to go ahead and very quickly, I'm just going to click on the editor widget. You'll see here, basically every single one of these widgets is going to give a description of what the widget does, how you work with the widget. It's going to give you samples of, because pretty much for every single widget we have, we should have an associated sample that uses it. So it's going to give you samples, references to other classes that work with this widget, different snippets and so forth. So again, I'm not going to go into all the details on that, but just so you know where it is. All right, so the very first demo I want to show you is our sketch demo. You may have seen these. I know Jeremy showed it a few times. Basically, we now have added, I'm just going to open this up. And this is just the sample that we have on our, on here. Open it up live, that we have in our SDK. All right, so what you may see, I'm just going to move things around a little bit because I got a lot of things on my window. So what you see here is we have our sketch widget, just the sketch widget itself. This is going to look a little bit different. We now have a settings that you can click on and enable snapping. So in this particular case, we're just working with the just the graphics layer. So this is another thing as well. If you're working with sketch, any type of sketch, that sketch has to have an associated graphics layer with it. So in this particular case with this sample, it's just one graphics layer. And what I'm doing is I can actually go in, and what you'll notice, there you go, is this is what we would call self-enabled snapping. Basically, it will show us the, like if we've got perpendicular lines, right angles, it will show, you go. It should show the symbology will show if we're working with parallel lines. I'll show you again in another sample here how you can work with snapping on additional feature layers as well. So again, this is just a straight sketch widget. There's not a lot of bells and whistles to this at all. If we took a look at the code, let me make it bigger so everybody can see, is you'll have that graphics layer, and I create that sketch. I pass in that graphics layer in the view, and I add it. There's nothing else to it. All right, so this is very, very basic, but I did want to show you just that cool new snapping UI that we've offered. All right. All right. All right. So our next sample is the editor. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this because Franco is going to shine when he talks about all of the things that you can do. But what I'd like to show you, so this is going to be, we actually have a basic editor sample right now, but this is going to replace that one. I kind of just wanted to give it a little bit more. We wanted to add a little bit more to it. Right now, it only just shows points and doesn't really do a whole lot. So we've added lines and polygons. And in addition to that, we've also enabled snapping under the hood. This is the difference. And the reason why I brought this up before about the sketch widget, or I'm sorry, about the editor not using sketch, but rather the sketch view model, is because right now the editor does not have that UI of the sketch. So we're not going to have that toggle like I just showed you. What you can do, though, is we have provided that same API for that snapping in the editor. So, and I'll show you in just a moment here, we have it just snapping options. You can enable it on or off. You specify the type of snapping that you want. And then if you're doing like snapping to layers, you just specify the feature snapping, the sources, the layers that you want to snap to. So in this case, this is set to be on by default within the code. But if I wanted to turn this off, just across the board, all you would need to do is just click on your control key and that will just toggle it on or off. So if I go in here, it's a little bit easier to see. I'm just going to click on, actually, I'm going to go back in. So what you guys see here, these are my templates. So this is the feature templates widget that I initially talked about. Okay, so this is the first part. So I'm going to click on the feature template that I'm going to add. I'm going to go in and there you go. See there. And you'll notice here I have my feature form. So this is a feature form that just popped up. So I can specify then the attributes that I want to show or modify within my feature form. We're not going to have that be a closure. Add that one out. And then I'm not showing you this, but if you actually open up the hood, like in DevTools, and just ran some network requests on this, you would see there is an apply edits that gets called. And that apply edits is basically taking in this added feature that I just created and passes it to that REST call. So it just does everything, like I said, under the hood. So we have that. And then the sketch. So basically what I just showed you there, there's no attachments on this one. All right. And then lastly, we have a feature table demo. So again, I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail on this, but I just wanted to show you that it is possible. Basically, all you need to do in this particular case is we have the same data. I'm just telling it in the feature table, there is an enable editing property that I can specify, setting that to true. By default, it's false. You set that to true, and it's going to allow you basically to edit any of the fields. You can actually even be more specific and lock down specific certain fields as well that you want to have to be editable or not. So if I went in here and I don't know, let's say, where's my wire down? Say it's not a wire down, it is, instead it's a dangerous animal. All right, so you'll see here that edits happen there directly within the feature table as well. So I kind of just threw a whole lot of information at you, but for the sake of time, I wanted to make sure I showed, you guys got all this good information. Again, the demos that I showed you here will be on the repo, but in addition to that, the first two, like the editor one that I just showed you, that is going to be updated and will be on production come when 4.19 is released. So with all of that said and done, I'm going to now go ahead and pass things over to Paul, and he is going to talk about forms.
Thanks, Heather. Let me just share my screen here really quick. Find my slides. All right, so like Heather said, I'm going to talk a little bit about the forms. And I guess if you might have been wondering throughout the the initial part of this presentation is how do I get a form and what is it? For some of you that have been editing in the web for a while now, the previous pattern was really centered around configuring the pop-up, setting whether or not fields are editable on the pop-up. So the new pattern is kind of a departure from that. We're kind of splitting out that data collection form from the pop-up. And so your pop-up moving forward is really going to be how you present the information that's been collected, and the form is really how you edit and update that information. And one of the motivations for that is to really give you flexibility when you're collecting data to kind of separate those experiences and tailor them for that activity. So the idea here is that smart forms themselves help drive a consistent editing experience across the ArcGIS platform. So over time, you'll see this start to kind of expand and come into different areas. Right now, today, you can take advantage of that in the JavaScript API, but you can also take advantage of it in Field Maps, the newer mobile data collection app. And the idea here is to kind of build a little more smarts into it so that you can improve the quality of your data and bring in some structural elements to help organize the information and make it easier for that worker, whether they're in the web or in the field, to consume. And eventually, we're going to be bringing in more rule-driven data collection for some folks that have kind of experienced attribute rules through the geodatabase. I think you'll see over time a lot of those concepts come into the form itself, so you can drive that on the form, as well as kind of just some simple, data-driven visualization. So being able to hide elements that aren't relevant based on the answers to the questions. So that's kind of smart forms in a nutshell. But let's take a look through a practical example here. So I've got Mapper up here, which is built on the same 4X API. And if I go to the Edit tool in the map viewer, which is the same widget that Heather just kind of walked you through, I'm just going to add a new feature here. I'm going to say it's a damage collection form, and we'll say this is unaffected. And so when I click on the map, I've got my form here. And so this is what we mean when we talk about the form. This is the place where we enter the information. And there's a few different things going on here that I want to call your attention to. You'll notice that in the incident name, we've got a hint here that actually gives the user some guidance. So everywhere as you see a field, you can provide a hint like this in an input box. You can provide a description as well as a title. So it gives you a lot of options on how you provide additional context to the person doing the editing and kind of support them and give them more guidance. And kind of moving down the stack here, we've got two groups. And so these are a set of questions that are logically related. So you can group those questions together. Some of these forms can get really long. So being able to expand and collapse those different elements as they become relevant or not relevant is really nice. So when we expand this here, you'll see a nice pick list. This is shown as a pick list because under the hood, it's taking advantage of a coded value domain. And so we pick that up automatically and we give you that pick list. Alternatively, if it meets your data, the style of your coded value domain, you can actually take any coded value domain and turn it into a series of radio buttons. I'd recommend that for when you have a handful of choices for the user for a given value. If you've got hundreds of entries in your domain, I'd still favor the coded value domain. And I think one of the more interesting ones, if we go to damage information, you'll see that this section is pretty uneventful. But if we look at the extent of the damage and we change that to anything but unaffected, actually, and we'll change it to major, you'll actually notice that you suddenly get more choices. So there's some underlying logic that we built into the form that actually knows to hide and show different input elements as they become relevant. So I'll show you how we got there in a second, but then you can fill those elements in and submit it when you're done. Today, if you want to author a form, you've kind of got two choices in front of you. One, you could do that through your, in code through your application as you're building it out. But as layers, as your form gets more complicated and you build in more logic, there's sometimes, it's nicer to have a visual element where you can kind of see everything and play with it and test it. And especially as you start to build in that conditional logic, which is powered through Arcade, it's nice to have, an experience to kind of build it visually. So today you can do that in field maps. This exact same authoring experience for the form that you see here today will come into kind of the kind of ArcGIS Online from the feature layers item page or through the web map in the future. So you'll be able to do this outside of field maps. But today, this is where you go to set the form. So you'll see the kind of anatomy of things on the right panel here. I've got a list of all of my attributes in the data set. I can add in some organizational elements like the groups. And if we were to hop down here and take a look at, let's take a look at the radio button here really quick. So when I click on an element that I've already added, I can see all of the properties here. I can choose to switch that. Maybe this wasn't a simple yes, no answer. I could switch that to a combo box or back as well. So you can kind of tailor those input elements. And right now, there's a small number of input elements, but over time, we're going to expand those to different things like sliders and simple switches so that you can kind of create a visual experience for your users that makes sense based on the data set. And like I mentioned before, you can give everything, a display name as well as a description. The description is really useful to provide that additional context. Just having the user enter in, a series of input boxes with no context is a really surefire way to kind of get errors. So the more guidance you can give folks when entering data, the better. But the interesting piece, I think, here that I talked about before was the conditional logic. So in this group, you'll see the three fields that make up the damage information. And you'll see this little icon here on the side here that matches the conditional visibility icon over on kind of the side panel. So when we click one of these, it actually already has an existing expression. And for folks that are familiar with Arcade, this is the same Arcade editor. You have the same functions available and things like that. And this is a pretty straightforward expression. It's really just saying dollar feature, for those who aren't familiar with expressions, just mean the active feature I'm working on. So when the features field type damage is not equal to unaffected, we return true. So basically with the conditional visibility, you return either true or false, basically, and that drives whether or not that element is visible. So in this case, if it's anything but unaffected, we get true. And that's how we're driving that logic. So as the extent of damage changes, these expressions are evaluated and those hide and show accordingly. And so you'll see that come into play in multiple areas too, as the kind of form evolves. You'll be able to do that on entire groups, as well as, this is kind of a small detail, but you'll notice that these expressions have different IDs. And right now, if we were to look at both of them, they actually have the exact same business logic. And so one of the enhancements that will be coming in the next release or two is we want to be able to let you author that business logic in one place and reuse it in across multiple fields, so that you're not stuck maintaining individual expressions across every one of those inputs. So it saves you time. You can update that logic in a central location if you discover that you had a bug in that logic. So I think that covers most of it from my side. I'll turn it over to Franco, and he's going to dive back into the code and show you how to kind of pull all this together and make an app.
Thank you, Paul. So in this next section, you'll step into the geeky portion of the presentation. And we'll be talking about some different options that you have as a developer in JavaScript for customizing the editor. And with that, let's start this section. And here, I just wanted to call out the how important it is to always be checking the reference pages, just to make sure that anytime there's something that we add, you have access to more details behind it. And I just want to quickly go over a few of the key properties here from the editor and explain what they do. and then we'll talk about how we can use them in our demo. So just wanted to highlight the fact that in Heather's demo, you saw the editor go between the create and update workflows. And for each one of these workflows, whenever one is active, it'll store a workflow instance in this property. And you also have some supporting properties that tell you whether you, based on the current layers that are available at a time, whether you can create or update with those layers. You also have ways of customizing editing on a per layer level. And if you remember the sketching aspect of Heather's demo as well, you can also enable that by using these props. And similarly, with all the supporting widgets that Heather covered that make up the editor, you can also override some of the defaults that are used by the editor itself. And what this allows you to do is it gives you a few customization options, right? And we'll show a few in a few seconds in the demo. We'll show how you can leverage these. So first off, with some of those props, you can toggle per layer whether you want to allow features to be added, updated, deleted, or if they're attachment supported, if you want to add editing for attachments as well. You can also take the concepts that Paul showed with smart forms and be able to define a smart form locally in your application using JavaScript. Going back to that snapping, you are also able to enable it and start taking advantage of the options, even though there's no UI way to turn it on at 4.19. The underlying supporting properties, you can customize some of the defaults if you wanted to fine tune the experience. You also have access to different methods that allow you to skip into different steps of a workflow. So if you remember, if you want to update a feature, you need to activate the update workflow and then select one and kind of step through those different parts of the workflow. With these APIs, you can just call on a method and directly start editing attributes, for example, if you wanted. And lastly, with these properties, you can also, with any similar to with any other accessor class, you can watch properties, and this allows you to react when any of these change. And I'll show how you can do that easily. So with that, let's step into the code portion. And before that, I just want to show the sample that I have here. And this is my demo application with for trails in the El Paso region. It allows me to edit the geometry of an existing trail, as well as populate the different attributes behind it. And this is the default experience you get with no configuration by consuming this layer. You get all the attributes based on their type. You get an individual input rendered. If there's a coded value domain, you'll get a select. That's by default all you get. And you can also update or delete the feature. And you can also start creating one of these different trails, right? So this allows you to quickly start adding trails if you wanted to and populate the different values. Cool. So that's in a nutshell how my demo is, what my demo does. So let's take a look at some of the options that you have for customizing this. And just covering the code, I have some utility functions I created earlier to kind of allow us to focus on the different examples. But all you need to know is I have this method here that will create that layer that is editable for the trails. Once that is ready, I will create the map that you see in the background. And once that's done, I use the view to create my editor. So let's take a look at some of the things that you can do. So first off, I talked about fine-tuning layer specific options, right? So I can do that by using the layer infos property of the editor. And what this does is it allows me to specify a specific layer and then toggle whether this layer should be enabled for editing at all entirely. If you wanted to not include it in any editing workflow, you can disable it entirely, or you can specify much more fine-grained options for editing. So we can, for this layer, we can, for example, prevent features from being deleted. And optionally, you could also toggle whether attachments should be shown. So if I go back and check out that configuration I did, and I select one of these features, the one that I just created, for example, you'll see that I no longer have the option to delete it. Cool. Let's move on to the second part of that. So that was layer infos, showing you how to edit, how to fine-grain editing operations per layer. Next up, let's show the sample that covers smart forms. So in this part here, I just want to, before going deep into this part, I want to highlight that all the features that Paul showed in his demo, all these features are defined in a spec in the web map. And you can kind of browse the spec if you want to get more information behind what each of these properties allows you to do. And with that, it also allows me to kind of get a better idea of what I can customize on my side. So once I skim that, I can kind of get a better idea of what I can do. So let's see how that ties into the form. So if you have a feature layer, you are able to specify a form template. And form templates, the feature form will know how to, if it sees it on a layer, it'll use it to display a better experience for editing the attributes. And in this case, I am able to set a custom title and description. And for each of the inputs, for each one of the attributes for the trail, I can customize each one of them. And the first thing that I did is to tweak the label that is used, because this is triggering my OCD. There's no spacing. The casing is off, so I can fix that with code by using the label attribute here. I can also exclude certain fields from being edited on the application. And I should also mention that all of these are edits that you can do that will be honored as long as they don't override what is defined on the service, like Heather mentioned before. For this next part, in terms of expressions, if you have arcade expressions, you can define these and use it in a layer, and in an input. So in this case, for the notes field, anytime that I'm going to define expressions that define whether this field is required and if it's visible. And the way I'm defining it is when there is a condition defined, referring to the previous field. When there is a condition defined, when it has a value I want to show and make this value required. So you can see in condition, there's no value, but once I change it, you should see, oh, I didn't refresh, that's why. Apologies. There you go. So now that's the title and description I was showing you. And here, condition, if it has a value, it'll show the notes field. If I remove it, it'll disappear. That's the other thing that you can do. And if you notice, there's also a placeholder text that I can define, as well as some description. You can do that through this object as well. So here, the hint will be used as a placeholder for that input, and then description here is that text that you see below it to give more context. You can also decide to remove some of these fields if you don't think they are relevant for your app. Anything omitted from this object will not be rendered in the form itself. Lastly, you can also customize the experience for anything that has a coded value domain associated with it. So in the track type field case, there is a coded value domain, and I can change it. Instead of being a drop down, I can tell it to use the radio buttons experience for that input. So I can do that locally as well. And I can also, related to that, change the actual text for the no value option. And also, if I wanted to omit it entirely, I can do that through here. Another thing is if I wanted to tweak or define, say I have a string field but I wanted to narrow down the options that the user can enter. I can do that by specifying a local domain here for coded values. And that's what you're seeing here to the right. Lastly, if I talked about this expression before, but just to kind of show what it does, the has condition defined basically will return true if the condition field of the trail feature has some content. That's sort of in a nutshell how you can quickly use some code to give some smartness to your form entry. For the next part, let's see how we can enable snapping in the editor. And you can do that by using the snapping options. So once you have snapping options here, you can enable it entirely. And you can also give it an array of layers to use for snapping. So any of these layers will be used as candidates for snapping to features. And I can show how that works now once it loads. Perfect. So let's say I want to modify this trail. I should be able to see some of those like snapping. If I wanted to make it easier to snap to specific features on the map, I can do that now. This is really useful when you're trying to kind of follow along different features that guide your trail. Cool. Let's go to the next example. As I mentioned before, the editor has some widgets powering it, right? It's using a collection of supporting widgets. And there's this object on the editor that allows you to tweak the defaults that get passed to initialize each one of these. And in this case, what I'll do is I can override the options that the sketch tool uses. So I can disable rotating and scaling entirely. So if I go back, discard, if I wanted to select this feature here for editing, you see it allows me to move and scale it. I can disable those options by using this object. Similarly with the attachments, let's see if I have any here. No, I can select one. With attachments, here you can see if the attachments are supported by the service, you'll get a listing displayed here that allows me to customize it, or if I wanted to add more. But I can also tweak some of the options that power the attachments widget here. In this case, I'm going to change the listing to be of type list, and then I'm going to disable editing. Now, once this loads, I can show you how that will look like for this trail. Cool, so now you can see there's no way of adding attachments. And now if I click on this image right here, it just takes me to the preview. It no longer allows me to upload anything or edit. So that was a quick way of showing how you can customize the underlying widget options there. I also said you can start at a specific step. So, and I can do that here by using some of these start workflow APIs. And in this case, I am using the start update workflow at feature edit method, which is a mouthful, but it tells you exactly what it does. And all it does is it'll take a feature, and this is just using a utility function that I made that will just return a random feature when the view loads. And I can use that to start editing at that specific step. So now, once everything loads, you'll see it'll go straight into the attributes editing segment. All right, and with that, we can go on to the next example, showing how you can leverage prop watching. And in this case, I kept it really simple for the purposes of this demo and time. But here, all that I'll be doing is I'll be watching for the active workflow property on the editor. And as I said, once you start or stop a workflow, this object gets modified. And I've kept it really simple so that whenever a workflow is active, it'll show a console message. So if I show the console here, clear it out, we'll see some messages pop up as I go in and out of these different workflows. Cool. So that was it in terms of some of the options that you have to customize the editor. All this code will be available in that link that takes you to the repo, and we'll share a link to it at the end of the slides. And that was the demo showing the customizing options. And to recap, we talked about what web editing means at the service level, all the different options that are available to you as you are defining different layers that you want to be editable. We talked about some of the out-of-the-box editor features, the different widgets that make up the editor and how they work. We also talked about smart forms in the editor and how you can author smart forms and just have the editor pick them up, make it easier to populate attributes. And lastly, I showed you some options that you have if you're working with JavaScript and how to customize your editing experience in your app. Before I forget, please remember to give us some feedback on the session. We would really appreciate any comments you may have. And with that, we can move on to questions. So if you want to check out the slides and source, and I believe the link is not correct. Instead of 21, could you add a 2021? And that should be good. We will share that later. And also, if you have a question for the team, you can use the link below that to throw a question to the JavaScript API team. And with that, we can move on to questions.
All right, should we start at the top of the list, folks? I think the first one on the list is, are the combo boxes filterable based on the input? And that's today, if you have the combo box open with the input, you can actually hit the keyboard keys and tab through them for the first character. But we can look at that as a future enhancement to be able to type and see the list filter while you're doing it. I noticed some of the mobile apps have that, and yeah, we can look at that in for consistency.
Now, the API side, I don't think they are filterable, but like Paul said, it's an enhancement we can add later on.
While I'm unmuted, how about I take I'll talk a little bit about the related features one just really quick too, because I know that's a hot topic in so many areas. Related records are something that we're working on throughout 2021. I think in addition to the data collection form, so through supporting it in the forms, we also want to bring in support at the pop-up at the same time so that users can actually visualize what they've collected in a consistent manner, as well as the table when navigating through the table. One of the enhancements that's going to come along with that in both the form and the pop-up is the finer grained controls over how the relationship kind of shows up in that form or the pop-up. So you'll be able to, rather than kind of enabling related records and having to see every relationship all at the bottom of the pop-up or the form, you'll be able to add individual relationships and then move them around as makes sense within your pop-up or your form, and even preview kind of the title or a little summary of each of a certain number of records in the relationship. So you could promote kind of the last inspection or the last 3 inspections into the form or the pop-up and so forth.
All right. There's a few in here that I've replied to. One that I know we've had a few questions on, just even over the past couple of days through the Ask Our Experts, was whether or not the editor widget supported multi-point feature layers. Currently, it does not. I believe we do have an enhancement to allow that coming up, but I would need to look at where it lies within our implementation. pipeline. But to answer the actual question itself, though, no, it doesn't support multi-point feature layers. Let me see, here's another one. Okay, someone asked about split and merge. Bryce, you asked about split and merge supported in 4X. I wasn't sure specifically if you meant kind of something similar. I know back in 3X we had some tools that were provided that gave you a little bit more like that UI that allowed you to do those custom functions actually. And the split and merge, we don't have that provided. I know we've talked about adding some additional things to the UI for the sketch. But for now, if you want to do any type of that, if you need that type of functionality, you need to use the geometry engine. And we do have some samples. I think I put that in there in that question. I added a sample for that.
I could hop in and take one. There was a question about whether or not you could split things up across tabs in the form. Today, there isn't a way. That's something we could sort of keep an eye on for future enhancement. We've tried to keep the form structure pretty generic in the sense that, like, you know, custom apps could opt to take individual components and leverage them as they see fit, or specific applications. So you could imagine, you know, maybe an app opts to interpret groups as individual tabs in a custom application or something like that. But there's no tabs explicitly modeled at this time. But like I said, we can kind of take that and add that to our list of future considerations. Franco, there was one at the top there, or Heather, about being able to edit features in batch. I don't quite know the answer to that one. Is that?
Yeah, that's another. We've had, this is another request that we've had over time. It is another one of the big ones. It's always on my list of things that we want to work on. You can do it. It's just not going to be easily done using the widgets. I might have some demos snippet. If anybody's interested, I can follow up and send it along. But there are ways of doing it. I mean, basically just querying, you can perform a query on whatever your layer, whether it's geometry or attributes or whatever it may be. That response that you get back, you can filter through those, get your features, get the attributes. You can update those attributes, pass those through to your edits on that feature layer, and that the feature layer apply edits. So again, this kind of would go down to that granular level that we talked about initially, where some of the functionality you'll be able to do directly using the widgets, but certain things it's just not there just yet, and this would be a good use case for that. Did you want to discuss the WCAG stuff, Franco?
Sure. When we develop any widget in the API, we're trying to make them as accessible as possible. We are constantly improving. So if you do notice that something is off, please let us know. We would really appreciate that. But yes, accessibility is part of our development workflow for all of the widgets that we have in the API.
There's a quick one there about is version 4 editing functionality enabled in Experience Builder or any template apps? That's a question I actually don't know, but I think that might be a good one to ask the experts in the online island, where they have people specific to those individual product areas that may have better insight about whether it's supported today or whether it's on the near-term roadmap.
And I think that would be under the Ask Our Experts showcase under the web development channel. You can post it there.
I guess, I think Heather or Franco, you answered the one from Chris, right, about fetching data and making the edits client side.
Yeah, so technically, again, you should be able to do this would need to be, again, something that you probably, so I'm reading this, move this over here. So you're fetching data from a hosted feature service, you make that edits on the client. All right, so save those in the client and apply those. Yeah, then that's yes, that's totally doable. The only thing that I've never done it on my end is you just would have to listen somehow, have a timer trigger or something set so it knows when that that service is enabled again. And once it is, then just call that feature layer apply edits. But yeah, again, I do have some little snippets that show how to just basically go in and use the sketch, just creating some geometries, and then passing those, you have them set on the graphics layer, passing that into the an associated feature layer, and then you can just call apply edits on that. So again, just if you want to, we can follow up afterwards and I can send some things out.
I just wanted to highlight this question. That's not really a question, just to make sure that people have access to the correct link for the slides and demo code. So that is the correct link. The only thing that was wrong was the last two characters. It should be 2021 instead of just 21. I can.
Chris, like the question from Chris, I'm not sure I fully understand your question, Chris, but if you find me, I think the showcase is still going on for a few more minutes after this, but if you come find me and clarify it, happy to try and answer it. But if the question is that, you know, the form that I authored through field maps just works in the JavaScript API, they're both interoperable. So that the whole idea there is that the field is, or the form is universal. And if the question is around the form authoring, right now that experience is just in field maps, but we'll eventually I'm into ArcGIS Online, and I guess it remains to be seen whether we would have a component to kind of make authoring forms easier in the future. That's something that we don't have any immediate plans for, but we could evaluate if there's the need.
I can tackle this one. Is it possible to watch or await the apply edit step of the editor? Technically, yes. If there's an event on the feature layer that you can listen to, I believe it's edits, and that can, you can hook into that. But we are working on on adding more events that you can use in the editor to know, like, to get more fine-grained eventing on the different parts of the workflow as you're making changes.
I guess there's one there that I had responded to earlier about that said, when you say host feature service, do you mean hosted on ArcGIS Online? And I guess I commented that I think everything shown here today is, you know, applicable to any feature service regardless of its underlying implementation, whether that's hosted in ArcGIS Online or through Portal through your hosted services, or backed by an enterprise geodatabase. That editing and how you interact with that service shouldn't really change depending on kind of where that service lives. Between different versions of the feature service, you may find different capabilities, but that, you know, what we've shown here today should be kind of universally applicable everywhere.
We have a question about, I've never heard of the Sketch product, but it sounds like it's the exact same thing I've been looking for. Can you provide some links to documentation? to investigate further. Yeah, the developers SDK, is it js.arcgis.com? Do you know the full URL, Heather?
Sorry, that cut out the last part. Can you repeat that?
The link to the SDK, that's I guess I can check it out. Okay, it's developers.arcgis.com/javascript/latest. There you can take a look at all the reference pages for all the widgets that we have. And so for the sketch case, you can definitely learn more about it there. You'll have access to info on the APIs as well as samples. So yeah, check it out.
I like to tell people, for the most part, especially if you're brand new, I mean, you can read doc all day long, but especially if you're just brand new, the best thing is just get into some samples and start tearing things apart to learn how it works. You know, and going in and mixing and matching and copying and pasting and working with your data and, you know, seeing what you can do with it. Pretty much how I've gotten through all these years with all this new technology. But yeah, check the samples first. That will definitely help, or should help you out.
All right, I think with that, I think we're out of time. Thanks for coming, everyone. And hopefully you enjoy the rest of the Dev Summit. Don't forget to fill out those surveys. We read all of them, so they matter.